What is the story of America? Is there such a thing? Is there only one story, or are there many stories? And if there are many stories, how are they woven? How can they be woven together to tell the story of America? Those are the questions that we've been wrestling with and asking over the course of this series and working to answer. The American Tapestry Project. We tell ourselves stories featuring Dr. Andrew Roth, JES Scholar in Residence. Here in this installment, we're going to turn our attention to the finale, the fusion thread, and we'll save some time to talk tapestry at the end, reviewing some of the key elements we want to dive more deeply into and some of the threads we want to pull just a little harder. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spagat and I'm the Vice President at the Jefferson and am a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me is Dr. Andrew Roth, the aforementioned scholar in residence at the JES, who also hosts the American Tapestry Project radio program, which airs on WQLN Public Media and is available on WQLN.org and the NPR One app. Now, after a deep examination of 1968, the year America shattered, according to Smithsonian Magazine, Dr. Roth launched his exploration of the American narrative, or narratives. In August, Dr. Roth and I looked at the overview of the American Tapestry Project, and on September 29th, hard to believe it's been that long, we have been working our way through, thread by thread, looking more deeply into these issues, the American Tapestry Project, over a series of episodes, working to weave that tapestry together over the course of that time and really examine our American narrative. Videos of those programs, as well as other discussions featuring Dr. Roth, are available for on-demand streaming at jeserie.org. In past episodes, we've examined humans as storytellers, freedom's storied abroad and in the U.S., freedom's fault lines, focusing on race and gender, the American dream, success stories, Horatio Alger and a nation of hustlers, and the immigrant's tale, which we covered in part 5 just recently. And now here we are at the finale to tie it all together with the fusion thread. Now, a quick note on Dr. Roth before we begin. Prior to joining the JES, Dr. Roth had an accomplished career in academia. From lecturing and leading, he taught various courses before going on to serve in various administrations in Erie and leading Notre Dame College in Cleveland as its president before retiring and being named President Emeritus. Breaking free of the tightening grip of retirement, Dr. Roth heeded the call to serve as the interim president at St. Bonaventure University. Now, seeing his vulnerability when it comes to maintaining a relationship with retirement, we at the Jefferson, we wrangled him in, and he's been serving as a scholar in residence ever since, offering numerous lectures, producing plenty of publications, and facilitating the Ramey Fellowship Program, an additional optional track for the Jefferson Civic Leadership Academy. Since this conversation is first airing live on the Jefferson's Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. And you'll see a big portion of this event is going to be that back and forth, those questions. So we welcome yours in that comment section. If you have a question, just leave it there in the comment section. But if you happen to be listening to or watching a later broadcast of this event, don't feel locked out. Still send us your questions and comments. We'll get them along to Dr. Roth, and we'll keep including you as part of this conversation. And of course, for more information about both past and upcoming Jefferson Educational Society programs and publications, do visit jeserie.org and be sure to find us on all the social platforms. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Andrew Roth, thanks for the finale. Here we are.
Well, it's hard to believe this is 7 weeks, even though we did take a little bit of a break last week for the election, and of course, we're still counting votes. But today, part 6, the fusion thread. And I'm reasonably confident that most of the folks watching this, or who will be watching it later, if not in real time with us right now, will look at it on YouTube or on the Facebook page or our website, are familiar with the basic concept. But just to bring that up to date, maybe a quick refresher, and for anyone who might be watching this, watching it from the end and then going back and watching the rest, the American Tapestry Project, as Ben said, is an attempt to try to figure out what's the story of America, or if there is such a thing as the story of America. Maybe it's any number of stories which, when woven together, hence the tapestry metaphor, when woven together, in fact, are the story of America. And a tapestry has 2 kinds of threads, warp threads, and we're not going to get into weaving, but it has warp threads that hold the whole thing together that are invisible. You can't actually see them in the final product. And in the American Tapestry Project, those warp threads, what we might call the foundation threads, the fundamental threads of freedom, equality, and opportunity, our ongoing experiment in self-government, which the word ongoing, I think, might actually be very critical as we watch this election unfold, whether or not we are going to see that experiment in self-government sustain itself, or perhaps we are at another moment in time. And then thread 3, blending diverse people into a people, and perhaps a people should have been underlined or and somehow emphasized, but the ongoing experiment in self-government based on freedom, equality, and opportunity has also had this problem. It's not a problem, but it's a challenge. It actually is the greatness of America, and we're going to get to that in about a minute or two. Blending diverse people and people from all over the world into a people, one people, as in we, the people in our foundational documents. We hold these truths to be self-evident, excuse me. We, the people, as in the preamble to the Constitution. The weft threads, the visible stories, the ones most people can see, well, there are probably 10, 12, 20, 30 X number of weft threads. I tended to gather them into 6, one of which is kind of a preface to all of this. We tell ourselves stories and why storytelling is important. I'll come back to that in a moment. Then we talk about freedom story at home and abroad. What does freedom mean? What does liberty mean? What has been its impact at home in the continental United States? Well, not just the continental United States. In the United States, you have to include obviously Alaska and Hawaii and Guam and Puerto Rico. But what has freedom meant, and how has it manifested itself? And our understanding of freedom at home, what has that meant for how America is perceived and how America has acted abroad? Then freedom's fault lines, in some ways one of the more controversial of the threads. Those are stories of race and gender, and those are really stories about people who were excluded from that freedom that is exalted in our founding documents, and how those stories of those people who were at first excluded, how they fought for their inclusion by appealing to those foundational ideals and themes. And as Martin Luther King Jr. said, just be true to what you put down on paper. As the women's movement and their statement of rights and sentiments in 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, modeled after the Declaration of Independence. Native Americans simply saying, honor the treaties that your government has signed. The United States government has signed something like 387 treaties since 1787, excuse me. And then the American Dream, which was first coined in the 1930s by James Truslaw Adams in his attempt almost 100 years ago to tell the American story. The American Dream was that notion that no matter where you entered, no matter what rung on the ladder you entered, you could actually, through the dint of your own enterprise and the dint of your own energy and self-discipline and hard work, you could climb to the top of that ladder. That is a foundational story, success stories, Horatio Alger stories. Horatio Alger, by the way, is the guy who wrote the stories. They're different characters, but it was all about people who started with nothing and became successes. And then, of course, embedded in all of that is the American self-improvement industry, the yes, I can story, as I call it, a sub-theme. And then a nation of hustlers. Americans are hardworking people, but there's also, and that's why it's in quotation marks, that kind of grammatical hitch, suggesting that we're using the word in 2 meanings. The meaning of people is very hardworking, industrious, but also some people willingness to cut corners and game the system. And then the immigrant's tale, which I, of course, has alluded to in the warp threads, trying to blend a diverse people. Everyone listening to this program today, unless you are descended from a Native American, you are descended from people who came from somewhere else. Some earlier, as I say, some earlier, some later, some sooner, some later, some willing, some unwilling, but you're descended from people who came from somewhere else. And today, we're going to look at what I call the fusion thread, the ever-expanding definition of the we in We the People. When that those glittering statements in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, we the people, quite frankly, the founders, which should give any originalist pause, quite frankly, the founders thought of we as being white male property owners. That's who we the people were. And we have now expanded that to include everyone, men and women, people of color, indigenous people, everyone is included in that now. And that we just keep expanding that definition. And I think that's really the great triumph of American civilization, but not everybody agrees with me. Not everybody agrees with me on that. So real quickly, in the interest of time, because I know Ben and I have a lot of questions that we want to chew on today. As I said, why, storytellers are important because we tell ourselves stories to make sense of our experience. It's that simple. Perhaps the most important story we tell ourselves is our history. All stories have an origin. All stories have something in them that are origin, where the people came from, who they are, how they got to where they are, how they are to behave, an ethical component, and it makes some statement about where they, or at least some inference about where they might be going. And so humans are storytellers. Humans tell themselves stories to make sense of their experience. And we've gone over that a number of times, and we'll come back to it in the question and answer. But right now, because I do want to get to those questions, let's take a look at what I call the fusion thread. And this thread is really, this is what America looks like. America is not only white guys like Ben and me and these two gentlemen here. That's actually not William Penn, and I'm drawing a blank on who he is. But America is made up of people from all over the world who create a mosaic, whether they're Hiram Revels, one of the first African Americans elected to the Senate, or Rosa Parks, whether they're a family of Italian immigrants, whether they're the Chinese who were excluded in the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, whether they're people from the Middle East seeking refuge and freedom, or whether this is a group here of, I happen to put this picture in here because I am actually one of them. These are Transylvania Saxons. And for those of you in Erie who might belong to the Siebenberger Club, and I'm certain that you have been there, the Siebenberger Club means Siebenberger is Saxon or German for the 7 villages or the 7 fortresses. And Siebenbergen land is where the Transylvania Saxons are from. And that's who they are. And I am actually descended from them. So editor's privilege in some ways, I put the Transylvania Saxons in there. So what is the fusion thread? Well, it really comes back to that ever-expanding definition of we, and we the people. And we sometimes forget that. It's self-rule by the people while ever-expanding the definition of the people. The two great experiments that we hold these truths, as I've said before, from the Declaration of Independence. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Who are the people? It's all of us, not some of us, not rich, not poor, not those who look like Ben and me, and it's everyone. And that's the genius of America. What makes America exceptional? I say that's what makes America exceptional. It's that we have done these 3 things simultaneously. We have believed in freedom, equality, and opportunity. We have 244 years in counting. We may be at a shaky moment, but we have 244 years in counting of self-government. And we've done both of those things while simultaneously, not always with good grace, not always with welcoming arms, brought people from all over the world into our midst and have blended them, or are blending them, because it's very much a work in progress, into a people, the American people. We hold these truths to be self-evident from the Declaration of Sentiments, that all men and women, that democracy is government of the people, for the people. Or as Walt Whitman said, I hear America singing the varied carols I hear, those of mechanics, each one singing his that should be blithe and strong, the carpenter singing. It's everyone. That's Whitman up there in the corner that I'm partially obscuring. It's what Emma Lazarus meant in the poem on the pedestal that holds up the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses. And it's everyone. It's we the people. And that's what makes America exceptional. And sometimes I think of the line from the Bill Murray movie Stripes, in which he said, if you'll recall the scene where he's trying to exhort the guys to work out, we're the best you can be. What's the best dog you ever had? It's a mutt. We're mutts. We blend the best of everything. And I would say we're mutts in the best sense of the word, is the way Bill Murray meant it. I don't know if Bill wrote it. I'm drawing a blank on the guy who actually wrote all those movies. He just died a year or two ago. Ben will probably tell that when we get to the Q&A. He'll remember him. But we're mutts in the absolute best sense of the word. We combine the best of all of the peoples in the world. If you wanted a banal, trivial example of that, American cuisine combines the best of all of the world. So without getting too maudlin, and as Martin Luther King says, that I believe is evidence that the arc of the moral universe might be long, but it bends towards justice. History will challenge that statement on any number of occasions, but I tend to agree with John Meacham, who tends to agree with Martin Luther King. It may not be pretty, it may not always be peaceful and loving, but over the arc of American history, we have included more and more and more people into the definition of we the people, and that's what makes us exceptional. And why is that important? Well, one of the catchphrases of those who say America is exceptional is we shall be as a city upon a hill. John Winthrop made that comment in his sermon, A Model of Christian Charity, which he wrote in 1630 on board the Arbella in Massachusetts Bay. Some people debate whether he actually wrote it in England, wrote it while they were crossing the Atlantic, or wrote it while they were at bay. Since it's a very complex and intricately and well-wrought sermon, I have a suspicion all three of those are true. He didn't just dash it off on the proverbial back of an envelope. But that's not why it's important. It was in that sermon, we shall, a model of Christian charity, that he said we shall be as a city on a hill. And what did John Winthrop said we have to do to be a city on a hill? He said, well, we must brotherly love without dissimulation. We must love one another with a pure heart. We must bear one another's burthens. We must not look only on our own things, but also on the things of our brethren. Or, quoting Matthew chapter 7, verse 22, whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do ye the same to them also. Actually, that is probably the most profound statement of interpersonal ethics ever uttered. Virtually every one of the world's major faiths says some version of it. And that deceptively simple statement seems to be incredibly difficult for humans to actually live up to. But that's the key to everything. Now, Winthrop said we have to do that because when he wrote that sermon, of course, he's in Massachusetts Bay. We'll give him that. He's on board the Arbella, 1630. Behind him, it's November. Behind him, he has the howling North Atlantic. In front of him, he has the forest primeval. If he and his fellow Puritans were to survive in founding Massachusetts Bay, they had no one to rely upon but one another. And he said, that's all we have is one another. And he exhorted his followers by saying, if we aren't true to one another, and this is, by the way, I always make the comment, it's probably the most famous sermon in American history that no one's ever read. And John Winthrop is quoted repeatedly, and no one's ever read, rarely if ever read him. And they quote that we shall be as a city upon a hill out of context. Winthrop did not mean we're going to be this bright, shiny thing up here. Oh, look at us. Aren't we wonderful? No, Winthrop was if he was anything, he was a stern man. Winthrop believed that he and his fellow Puritans had entered into a new covenant with God and that they were going to found the new Israel. And that as a covenanted people, they would be as a city on a hill. They would be as a city on a hill, exposed to the eyes of all men, exposed to the eyes of God. if they were not true to their values, if they were not loyal to one another, if they betrayed their values and betrayed their God, they would be exposed. Very, very different than as the phrase is frequently used. And what did Winthrop say would happen if we betrayed those values? Well, God would know, so would everyone else in the world know, and we would become an evil story in the mouths of our enemies. We shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses, and we be consumed out of the land. No one ever quotes the rest of that sentence, possibly because that's a pretty austere statement. The takeaway, if we want to be, as Ronald Reagan's press secretary Peggy Noonan recast it, not his press secretary, his speechwriter recast it, a shining city on a hill, then we have to learn to, I'm going to go back 2 slides. We have to learn to love one another without dissimulation, to bear one another's burdens, and to not only look on our own things, that is to say, not only be selfish and care only about ourselves, but also to care about our brethren. And if we do that, then that would make us exceptional. That would make us a shining city on the hill. And we, the people, then would truly become e pluribus unum. I like to alter out of many one to out of many we would become we. Now that's easily thought of as a platitude, and the fact that it's sometimes thought of as a platitude is because we're not always true to it. But I think over the course of our history, we have been more true to it than we have been untrue to it. Although at the present moment, we are being challenged to listen to Winthrop and to understand what Winthrop meant. And I have faith, a little shaky at times recently, but I have faith that we can do that. And apparently so does the rest of the world, because even though I don't have the Neil Diamond music here, they're still coming to America. These are actual photos. This one's from cleveland.com, 1/30/2019. This is one down here is the Erie Times News. If I want to really feel old, the judge in the middle of that picture was a student of mine a long time ago. These are naturalization, new citizenship ceremonies, both in Cleveland and in federal court here in Erie, Pennsylvania. So that's the fusion thread. So now, Ben, I know you've got a lot of questions, and we've been thinking about different questions. Here are some, but what do the folks want to talk about? What do we want to chat about with all of this?
So I think this might be asking a lot, and before I ask it, I will thank you, Dr. Roth, for all the work you've put into this. I know this has been an ongoing series. I think that's part of the novel approach of this, is continuing to build out this project, to build out the tapestry, so to speak, as we continue to unpack more and more. And I know you've put in a tremendous amount of time, energy, and effort on all of this. So on behalf of the Jefferson, on behalf of all the watchers and all the listeners and those who attended the lectures in person when we were able to do that prior to the pandemic taking hold, a big thank you, honestly, for this work. We appreciate it. I think it is so helpful, and it's certainly informing. We learn a lot from this. So a big thanks up front. But I think that a lot of folks, might be wondering, okay, I've learned a lot. I've heard a lot. I've had a lot to chew on. What is the American story? If you had to distill it down to a phrase, a short answer, how do you answer that? If you're in an elevator ride between floors and somebody says, I heard a part of the American tapestry, Dr. Roth, now tell me, I'm getting off at the next floor. What is the American story? How do you answer that?
I think if I tried to turn that into one sentence, I don't know if I can make it it has to be a declarative sentence.
And you can use as many semicolons as you want.
The American story, I think it's back to that first couple of slides. The American story is the story of diverse people from all over the world, learning how to live with one another in peace and harmony, while simultaneously attempting to be true to the founders' ideals of liberty, equality, and opportunity, and simultaneously trying the ongoing experiment in democratic self-government. And that is an immense challenge. And why do I say that's an immense challenge with, so at the risk of oversimplification? History would tell you a couple of things. That the British and their constitutional monarchy have been at this now for the better part of a millennium, but I think you could actually say they've only really been an exercise in self-government after the reforms of the Reform Bill of, is it 1832, something in the early 19th century. So they're not quite as old as we are. The Roman Republic fell after a period of about 150 years. The golden age of Periclean Athens turns out to have been about 150 years. Most of the democracies in Europe and around the world are not post 19th century, post 18th century inventions. Actually, from the middle of the 19th century to today, the great explosion of democracies, the late 19th, early 20th century. So self-government, or at least democratic, small d, democratic / Republican, small d, small r, government is not the main thread in human history. The main thread in human history is actually some version of, I want to be careful of the word I choose, because in contemporary politics, certain words have become loaded, but the main thread has been, shall we say, a kind of a more ambivalent statement, top down rather than bottom up. Democracy is bottom up. I think our founders wanted to land somewhere in the middle. They definitely didn't want top down. So self-government is a rare thing in the history of the species, at least elaborate self-government is. Blending diverse people, the history of multi-ethnic nations is not pretty, generally speaking. And freedom and liberty are modern conceptions. I mean, they come out of the Enlightenment, or at least the sense that everyone is entitled to them comes out of the Enlightenment. So we are like fish. You know, what's the old joke? Who discovered water? You can be pretty certain it wasn't a fish. Can't see the obvious because you're in the middle of it. Americans sometimes can't see the obvious because they're in the middle of it. This is, and I don't mean to annoy people who elsewhere, this could get very easily sound like American triumphalism or American exceptionalism, and I don't mean it that way at all. It's not beat your chest. I'm just saying that Americans need to step back and understand just how precious and rare what's been going on in this continent for the last 200 years is, with all of its flaws. I'm not being Dr. Pangloss and Candide. I'm not, you know, I was about to say whitewashing, bad metaphor. I'm not trying to scrub things clean and pretend bad things didn't happen. It's a complicated story, but I think that's the story.
Well, and I think that that's part of the important part of the series is acknowledging the fault lines along the way, where we haven't gotten it right, where we've worked to do it better, and where still yet a lot of work is needed to be done. I think of it, you know, I've heard you say this before in these presentations. You know, if you and I were to head to another country, and I think you use France as the example, we could become citizens and we could work to become, you know, part of the French community, but we, in a very different way, would never be French. You know, we were always the outsider. And I suppose I see this, I see America as a welcome sign, and all are welcome and you're part of this. And the no is not illuminated on the vacancy sign here of we continue to welcome people in and we continue to broaden that diversity. And I think that's, you know, I think that's what you're hinting at, is that that's what makes us exceptional, not in the sense of we're better, but just that we're different. It's a nation founded differently.
And that difference, by the way, is fragile. Yeah, I remember making that comment that, you know, you and I could go to France and live there for 50 years and never be Frenchmen. We would always be the person who was from somewhere else. France, as it turns out, or to be French, actually is a little more nuanced than people think. But we'll use them as an example. American ethnicity, that's even an interesting word, American ethnicity. I'm not entirely sure if there is such a thing as American ethnicity. I think American ethnicity might still be evolving, but ethnicity is usually defined somehow as a people who are rooted to a certain place through blood, that for generations and generations and generations and generations they've been there. And there are people in America today, white ethno-nationalists, to identify one group, who would like to define American ethnicity as an ethnicity of blood and soil, that the only real Americans are people who are descended from white people who have been here a long time, which would be certain subgroups, not everyone. And that, I think, is part of the controversy that swirled around the 1619 Project of the New York Times, as somebody pointed out to some people. Well, that's an interesting thing, because if you're talking about people who have been here a long time, well, African Americans have been here since 1619, and so unless you happen to be descended, unless you are a descendant of Spanish conquistadors or Spanish settlers in Florida, unless you are descended from a handful, and when I say handful, I mean handful, literally less than about 1,800 Englishmen who happened to be in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619, then African Americans have been here before any of you. Now, whether or not that's when American history started, now we have to define what do we mean by American history. But I got off the track here a little. Let's get back.
And that's
American
okay.
ethnicity isn't an ethnicity of blood and soil, although there's some people who would like to define it that way. American, I don't even want to use the word ethnicity. To be an American really means you buy into a certain set of ideals. Now, if you believe in the rule of law, to a certain extent, free markets, that one might be self-government, equality before the law, etc., and about 2 or 3 others, then good, you're in. You swear allegiance to that and to the Constitution of the United States, which guarantees or attempts to guarantee all of that, you're in. And that's different than any place. I'm not going to say it's different than any place else in the world, but this was the first place where that was true in large measure. And I believe it still remains one of the rare places where that is true.
And I think the fact that, we continue to welcome of all, back to the poem from Emma Lazarus that you mentioned, it's not a point-based system. We're not saying give us your best and brightest. We will take anyone. And I think that's what makes America different in that sense. And I think it is, to acknowledge a challenging part of where do we start our story? What is the beginning? Is it 1619? Is it the Constitution? Is it before? Because we look at, having various modes of how folk got here. And we have Native Americans being part of that story, who were here, and then settlers showed up. But we have settlers also bringing with them as property, indentured servants or slaves, and folding that into the story. And I think that's what makes this so challenging, is working on what is the point of origin we all agree the story begins, and how are we then working to better fold in the stories that perhaps we've ignored for quite some time. But stories is what I want to hang on here, Dr. Roth, because one of the things that we start each episode with is, humans are storytellers. I can't help but think both you and I have a background in literature, and I think of sometimes the artifacts that can serve as in terms of understanding what was thought at the time, understanding culture at the time. I just want to push you a little bit on our ability to look at texts now that written decades, if not centuries before us, and look at them perhaps out of context, but to get a better picture of ourselves. And so I'm wondering just your insight on the importance of stories, and then how we examine them as time continues to march on. I'm thinking of things, if we look at Huck Finn, the language in settings being used there. The Great Gatsby, Sun Also Rises. We're looking at some of the 20th century great American literature, 19th century great American literature, that we then have conversations about, should we edit some of the words out? So stories as artifacts. I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Well, I think that's actually a great question. It could be a whole episode on the American Tapestry on the QLM project, or a future episode or a future presentation here, because we're at episode 6, and there's literally not to use math talk, but there's an endless number of episodes. We tell ourselves stories to make sense of our experience, but one of the things that we discover is that the stories change. And without getting into literary theory and arguing about all of that, the intention of the author is not really important. It's not unimportant, but people can set in motion a chain of anytime you read a text. I used to teach a course, an intercession course, one of these special topics courses. I stole a word from Disneyland. I called it Imagineering, in which I'd have students write stories about the stories they read, because the reader creates the story as much as the author creates the story. There's a mutual act of creation going on. The author depends upon the reader having the wit, the imagination, even the informational database. Boy, that's a dumb word, but you get what I mean, to be able to understand. But once the author sets that in motion, it goes in a lot of different directions. I always used as an example that Fitzgerald seemed to understand that in The Great Gatsby, because Gatsby's never described. His clothes are described, his cars are described, some of his mannerisms are described, his house is described, but he's never actually described. And that's because, and that's why I think it has almost always failed in movies and television. Almost always failed. There have been a couple of good attempts. The Baz Luhrmann one with Leonardo DiCaprio, I think a couple of about, I don't know, more, probably 10 years ago now, but I think they came close to getting it. But the minute you have an actor play him, boom, that's who he is. And some people can pull it off and some people can't. What's interesting about that is stories, though, work in the other direction too. Even if they're nonfiction, they become almost windows into a culture, and they can bring you up short. For example, in The Great Gatsby, since we're talking about it, and Adam Gopnik in a New Yorker article about 10 years ago said the 3 almost perfect novels in American literature are The Catcher in the Rye, The Great Gatsby, and Huckleberry Finn. Perfect, he thought, because they were just perfectly self-contained. I might disagree with him, because Huckleberry Finn ends up kind of, the ending of Huckleberry Finn's a little contrived. It was like Twain got him down the Mississippi, then wasn't sure what the hell to do with him, and he kind of arbitrarily brings in Tom Sawyer. Well, we don't need to get into that. If you read The Great Gatsby today with the eye, the reader is as important, the reader's as important as the writer. It's an act of mutual creation. The sexism, the racism, the anti-Semitism is jarring. And Fitzgerald was not consciously, and there are people who will tell you that might make it worse because it was just part of the air you breathed. But I think Fitzgerald would take exception to being called racist, sexist, or anti-Semitic. Maybe, I don't know that exactly for sure. I'm giving maybe him more benefit of a doubt than he deserves. But it's not even put in the novel to draw attention to itself. It's just it's just the way the world was. And that novel then becomes a window into a gone world where this was just the norm. And so now you have to ask yourself, well, is this still a great novel, or is it now we get into an interesting question of, I would say, yes, it's a great novel, but it might be morally problematic in some ways. Huckleberry Finn, most of the criticism about Huckleberry Finn isn't against Twain, because anybody who reads Huckleberry Finn, with, as a former colleague of mine said, with the brains to blow on hot soup, realizes that Jim's the only adult in the book. And that Huckleberry Finn makes an incredibly important moral decision, that he can either turn his friend Jim in, Jim is a fugitive slave, he can either turn him in, or if he goes with Jim to the Indian country, he will go to hell. That's what his culture tells Huck. And Huck thinks about it, and he said, well, Jim's my friend, then I'll just go to hell. And he and Jim take off for the Indian country. I mean, so it's a profoundly anti-racist, anti-discriminatory novel. What gets people's shorts in a knot is that there's a modifier affixed to Jim's name, the N-word that I'm not going to use, that gives people a brain cramp. And of course, the window into the world is, that's just the way people, you know, in Missouri in the 1850s would have talked.
And there are still people today
so
that talk like that.
For today, for 21st century people, I would say read the novel and ignore the word. And if somebody wanted to cut the word out, I don't think it wrecks the novel. The story holds.
I think it does,
you lose
too.
the window into the past, or the window into the past is closed a bit. But I get that word is offensive. The Catcher in the Rye is a different, it doesn't really work in this context. I'm not sure what, well, there's some casual sexism in The Catcher in the Rye, although Holden tends to land on the right side of those issues, even though as a teenager he can't articulate why it is he wants to protect Jane Gallagher from his roommate Stradlater, but Holden ends up on the right side there. Yeah, so, you know, great literature, I don't even want to use the word great, stories that work, they're windows into the past. You can read them either as historical artifacts and they're windows into the past, or you read them on their own terms as aesthetic experiences. I'm just driving a bunch of literary theorists, if anybody's watching this show, crazy.
Well, I
which
think,
is okay.
Andy, I think
They'll
one
survive.
of the things, yeah, I think if anything, literary critics are going to survive. I think they'll be fine. I think that, you know, rereading some of these today allows us to measure how far have we come. You know, what might we have missed when we first read it, you know, whether that was 10 years ago or 40 years ago or longer. And then have conversations in the progress we've made by taking a look at an examination of a story at a particular time, and then where we stand now. What did it teach us? How did we learn from it? And what does it still stand to teach us? And I think that's where, you know, it does a lot of heavy lifting here, but people will call stories timeless. And that there's a reason that they're timeless, because they continue to teach us something. Their lessons may change over time, but they continue to be something that we point to learn from. Another subject, of course, and I just want to move on to this one. I think it's easy to say history is important because those who don't learn it are doomed to repeat it. You know, we've heard that a gajillion times. But in this context, you know, thinking about our history and how we tell it, what makes this so important to you in your approach to this? And I ask that with the caveat, I want to follow up with the revisionist history of trying to go back and maybe the uncomfortable things, like scrubbing a certain word out of a certain text, or telling the story differently and altering the means through which we tell it. So why so important to you to unpack all of that history? How do you do it? And then when we think about revisionist history, how do we contend with that today? And using a buzzword of today, cancel culture. How do we work through all of that? I know that's a lot to unpack, but I want to look at history now, Andy.
those are a lot. That's a really there's a lot of really good questions there, Ben, and it kind of touches back to what we were talking about with literature, because while you were asking that question about revisionist history and cancel culture and using great strike the word great, using literary texts that have somehow withstood the test of time and people continue to read them, or even those that are obscure. Actually, it'd be interesting to use the pop literature of past eras that no one longer reads. But this could be actually another episode. There's endless episodes in which you take I'm going to call them benchmark pieces of benchmark works of art, and we're talking here literary, theatrical, films, plays, music, and deconstruct their values in terms of their time, and then measure that against where we are now. And I think you could use that as some evidence that Martin Luther King's right about the moral arc. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice, because Gatsby was written in 1925, so not quite 100 years later. Certain attitudes in there are no longer acceptable. So we ask ourselves, is that progress? Is that not? What does that mean? The basic story about Gatsby, which is one of those on the screen there, the Yes I Can strain in the American Tapestry. Gatsby believed in that wholeheartedly. Gatsby believed in the American self-improvement, that you could transcend your roots and become whatever you had the wit. He just happened to have misunderstood hustler, actually, because Gatsby's a gangster. There's no way around that. It's finessed over, but it's basically that's what Gatsby was. Revisionist history, though, and looking at history, I think calling it revisionist history is an attempt to discredit it. It's a negative look at what history actually does. History's always being revised. The phrase revisionist history is an attempt to accuse it of distorting somehow, or of telling the story wrong. But I think of history differently. I think of history as an unfolding. John Lewis Gaddis, in a book called The Landscape of History, which is a wonderful short book, his notion of history is that you are looking at a landscape. He uses landscape painting. I might say you are looking at history through a camera. I only say the camera because there's a lens, but it's a landscape, and you are limited just like the camera. There's a frame. Your experience is limited. You cannot look at everything all at once. You'd go crazy. I mean, humans are that. You are actually limited, but you're looking at it. And so go with me with the metaphor. He sees what historians do as new information is unfolded, as new documents are discovered, as new ways of looking at old things occur. History is like a landscape that is constantly coming into better focus, making things clearer. And therefore, it's never really done. History can never be, I love one of the metaphors he uses. People say, well, history is a map of the past. And he says, well, that's an interesting metaphor, but even a map is not one-to-one reality. If a map was one-to-one reality, it'd be reality and you can't take it with you. It has to be an abstraction. So he said, to a certain extent, you'll never recapture the entire past. You're always trying to recapture, to the best you possibly can, some understanding of what happened, how it happened, and why it happened. And historians work the same terrain as journalists: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And so revisionist history is, and I'm drawing a blank, I had a phrase, that is a kind of like a negative phrase to discredit what is actually what happens all the time. in history as more things are learned or different ways of looking at things are told.
So, Andy, I can't
Cancel
help
culture is interesting. Cancel culture is a variation on what we were talking about, great literature. Again, great slips in. Icons of literature, let's call it that, or iconic works of literature who are now, you look at them through our eyes, what is going on there. Cancel culture is about icons of history. I mean, and Heather Cox Richardson in her recent letters to an American talks about, history is constantly being revised, but not edited out or changed because you're constantly learning more. And your values change. And in a recent letter, and I used it in episode 4 of this project that's now, it was aired Sunday on QLN. It's now on, all 4 episodes to date are now available on QLN's website. I said, what do you make of the fact that for most of history, and I have a bust, if I look behind this computer screen I'm looking at right now, there's a bust of George Washington in my office. And, Washington's, in some ways, he's a hero of mine, although not an uncritical. I'm not uncritical in my appreciation of Washington. He's a person I admire a great deal. I mean, we're involved with the thing called the Jefferson Educational Society, and I always say, if you wanted to have a really wonderful dinner conversation, you'd want to go to dinner with Thomas Jefferson, because the wine would be better, and he's a polymath. But if you were at point A and wanted to get to point C and you thought point B could cause you problems, you would want George Washington, because he could figure out how to get from A to C, around, through, over, or under B. But as Richardson points out, George Washington's refusal to become a king, which he did twice. He resigned his commission at the Annapolis Convention after the Revolutionary War. George III said that made him the greatest man in the world because nobody had ever done that. He declined to be Caesar. Napoleon comes 20 years later, actually maybe 30 or 40 years later, 30 years, but he declines being Napoleon. And then he did it a second time in 1796 when he didn't run for a third term, and you had the first peaceful transfer of power in human history. Actually, a more noted one would have been the election of 1800 when Adams finally conceded to Jefferson. Jefferson was elected president and Adams left. But that was the first time, kings did not give up being king. You just didn't one day walk in and tell the courtiers, hey, I'm tired, I'm going hunting. No, that's not how it worked. You were king for life, and that cut both ways. But Washington did that. But Washington also owned, as Richardson pointed out, slaves. Now, he was the first founder, not first, he was the only founder who freed his slaves. Some people snipe at him and say he did that at the end of his life, just before he died. He did that because he was playing to history. There's a little bit of truth in that. But Washington was a slave owner, and he was a man who believed in self-interest. In his diaries, he has the note that slaves don't work hard because they have no interest to be gained from their labor. He was conflicted about it, but he did not liberate his slaves until the end of his life. And he was actually pretty aggressive in trying to get fugitive slaves returned to him, such as Hercules the cook and Martha Washington's personal secretary, personal maid, Ona Judge. So what do you make of that? Well, you tell both stories. You got to tell both of it because it's part of the whole story. You don't just belabor the negative part and ignore the colossal importance of the first part, that is, he refused to be king, because at the risk of, I don't mean to offend anyone, there are a lot of slave owners. In fact, in terms of the time, you have an open debate historically about where slavery fits in all of that morally. We abhor it now, but it was not always abhorred. But Washington is on a very, very short list of people who refused to be king.
I think that
to
that's
believe.
part of the telling the story full is being able to capture all those vantage points. And one of the things I can't help but think of, Andy, is when I first got whatever the last version of iPhone is that came out with the panoramic picture. I of course did like many people and tried to take a picture that wrapped around the entire place I was. Of course, you can't do it. It's the limits of technology and the limits of person. And I think that bringing it back to that camera analogy, it's the idea of taking pictures. We can only capture so much, but if we have multiple photographers at different areas throughout that landscape, we really get that full picture when we start looking at what they saw, what they focused on, and what was important to them. And that's not to dismiss the accomplishments of Washington and his significance of not becoming king, but then also to acknowledge he was a slaveholder. He was not kind to his slaves. And yes, there were many slaveholders, but slavery is not a good thing. It is bad. And that's a target of our history. We argue whether that's our original sin or pushing back the native population, taking a land they had declared theirs, our original sin. We debate over what's the worst thing we've done. Both of those are really bad. Both of those are really dark parts of our history. But it's important to take stock of all of those images and to be able to put them together to say that is our full picture. I'm trying to be mindful of the clock, Andy. I know we only have a few minutes left to go through the questions that we do have.
We could talk about this forever.
I know we can. And so I'm going to skip ahead to one and just ask you briefly to comment, because it's something we're seeing more pronounced today, perhaps, than we had observed prior. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm just feeling it in the moment because I can't help but continue to read about a lot of it, having grown up in rural America and having now experienced, an urban lifestyle in various cities. We see the pronounced divide between urban and rural. You touched earlier in episodes the root of that. Tell us about the root really quickly. Why are we still observing that conflict between urban and rural?
And I know our colleague Charles Brock has mentioned that we should do a series or at least a program, if not a series of programs on the urban-rural divide. And I think it's really important because it is one of the defining characteristics of America at the moment. Not just America. I mean, it's a global phenomenon, but it's particularly acute here, and we see it right in Erie. In Erie County, there's north of 90 and south of 90, and I realize that's an oversimplification, but as a kind of barometer, the roots of it go way back in American history. I think in the series, in the episode on business in America, I talked about how we tell ourselves that we're Jeffersonians. Even people who've never heard the phrase Jeffersonian or aren't sure what Jeffersonian might mean. Thomas Jefferson believed in a country of independent yeoman farmers. And of course, he lived in a country that was much, much smaller, of independent yeoman farmers, freeholders. They could care for themselves and therefore were independent. Jefferson abhorred, for example, wage labor, which he called wage slaves. He didn't believe in that. If somebody's paying you to do something, well, then you no longer are free to express your opinions. The other view, the Hamiltonian view, is Alexander Hamilton's vision of America, and it actually was visionary in his report on manufacturing, his report on banking. Alexander Hamilton envisioned an America of industry, of capitalism, of manufacturing, of industry and manufacturing fueled by finance, by interest in debt, which, interestingly enough, did not exist in Alexander Hamilton's world. So when you say he was a visionary, when I say he was a visionary, he was truly a visionary, because part of the problem that we have with the urban-rural divide is we tell ourselves we're Jeffersonians, but we live in Alexander Hamilton's world. And the rural world is the remainder or the echo of that Jeffersonian vision, although there are fewer and fewer and fewer small farms. And the urban world, the cosmopolitan world, is Hamilton's world. And trying to reconcile those two. There's also a route that's very, very contemporary. It's actually the book notes I'm working on right now for this week. Hopefully I can get it done tonight or tomorrow and not drive Pat crazy with the last minute editing. in which Michael Sandel points out, part of, I think, what's gone on is in the urban cosmopolitan world we have created a world of highly educated elites, and we have made them arbiters. And they, in their smugness, and to a certain extent, I don't think I'm smug, but I'm part of that elite, I guess. If you use academic degrees, etc. There has been the sense that the future belongs to the cities and the world is past. And people don't like to be disrespected. And so what I think you see rural people feeling and expressing in their voting and their political inclinations in the contemporary world is their resentment at that urban condescension. And that's an elaborate topic, and we just skimmed across the top in about 2 or 3 minutes. But the roots go back to Hamilton and Jefferson. The contemporary version of it is the condescension of urban areas to their rural cousins, and nobody likes to be condescended to.
I think that's an astute point of our relationship with each other and being able to observe that. And I think that there are many pressures that, and thank you for unpacking that in just a couple of minutes, because we could go on and go deeper into that, and perhaps that's its own discussion, looking at the economic pressures, looking at the concentration of populations, following the fact that a large amount of our GDP comes from concentrated areas. And so we see economic pressure being applied when it comes to urban and rural, and what that means. And two, then folding in the COVID-19 pandemic, when we see not a mass exodus, but the start of an exodus, and we don't know where it's headed as the pandemic remains unending and open-ended. People are leaving the cities to go into rural areas now because they can buy land cheaply. They can live a quieter, simpler life. And perhaps, most significant, they can work remotely now. They don't have to be tied to a city or a suburb where there's an industrial park or there's an innovation district park. They can do work over the internet. So if infrastructure is there, they can move wherever they want. So it'll be fascinating to see the impact on that. I think looking at the clock again and then looking at the question, I think it's unfair for me to ask you right now, is 2020 a worse year than 1968? Because there's still 50 days on the clock. And so maybe that's a program we can come back and have in 2021 and compare some timelines, because it is a program that you had done early for us here in the digital programming, taking a look at the comparisons, because we've heard it a lot, that 1968, 2020 is the new 1968. I think maybe that's fair to save as we turn the calendar from December to January, and you and I come back and discuss that and look at the trials,
I think that
tribulations.
could be a good episode after January 20th or 21st.
So we'll be right back here on January 22nd to talk about that. So the final question I want to ask you, Andy, in all of the work you've done and continue to do, is that one right there at the bottom of this slide. What gives you hope in America? When as storytellers, we more fully and accurately tell our story. So what gives you hope that we're doing that? And then to round that out and make it as whole as possible, what tempers that hope?
Well, what gives me hope is that as we understand more and more about ourselves, we still believe in those foundational values. And most of us still believe in those values. We sometimes maybe interpret their nuances differently. And we are at a moment in time, right now, November 10th, 2020, is probably frighteningly similar to some dates you could pick in the late 1850s. I think this is one of but the federal period in the 1790s got pretty testy. There were other periods in time that got fairly testy. But I think what gives me hope is that I do agree with John Meacham and Martin Luther King that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. All of American history has bent in that direction. Right now that is being tested. But I do believe, and I am optimistic, that the system will hold. What tempers that hope is that there are a lot of people out there, some in very significant places, who don't agree with me and who act on their disagreement. The one story, the one thread, Freedom's Fault Line: Tales of Race and Gender, the greatness of America, as Martin Luther King said in his last speech, is the right to protest for rights. The greatness of America is actually seen in those who were excluded, or at least initially excluded, from the benefits of freedom and liberty. Was they fought for their inclusion. Native Americans, African Americans, women, others, they fought for their inclusion by appealing to those rights. Those who would have excluded them denied those rights. And we are at a moment in time right now where some people seem to want to deny those rights. But the main thrust has been to reassert them and reaffirm them. And it's going to be a very interesting, to say the least, 9 weeks. But I'm confident, I'm optimistic that the better angels of our nature will prevail.
And I think that certainly hints at one of your most recent book notes, in which you do examine William Butler Yeats's The Second Coming. We talk about that center and whether it cannot hold. We examine that poem and we look at it today. I think too, one of the things for me is the idea that people continue to appeal to belong and gain access and entry, to broaden the definition, to expand it, not to break away and create something else. And I think that that's what gives me hope, is that more people are trying to gain access in than run away from and create other.Maybe that's another conversation for another day, but Dr. Andrew Roth, scholar in residence at the Jefferson Educational Society and host of the American Tapestry Project on WQLN Public Media, with episodes available on the NPR One app and online at WQLN.org. Thank you for your time, energy, and efforts in this project, and for joining me here in this conversation and chewing on these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.
And to all of you watching along at home or tuning into a later broadcast, streaming this on demand for free, thank you for being part of our conversation. We welcome you back always to be a part of our conversation, keep you involved in this, and keep moving along. If you have ideas, suggestions, recommendations on where to head next with the American Tapestry Project, or heard something you want to hear more about, do let us know. You can email either of us at our last names. They're right there on the screen, Spegan and Roth. So Spegan at jeserie.org, Roth at jeserie.org. We'd love to hear from you. Love to keep this conversation going, find out other things to talk about as we continue to plug in to an ever-evolving, ever-growing series, just like the nation we are discussing. We will, of course, be back here for more conversations, more programs as we work through Jefferson Educational Society digital programming. But to catch other discussions featuring Dr. Roth, including 2 looks on 1968, to read his book notes we've mentioned a couple of times here, head over to the Jefferson Educational Society website, jeserie.org. You'll find those videos. You'll find other videos of past presentations available for on-demand streaming, other publications, including reports, essays, and timely writings, as well as more information about upcoming JES discussions. And of course, be sure to find us on the social platforms. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Spegan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.